Hello, and welcome to Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review, TNSR. I'm Doyle Hodges, Executive Editor of TNSR. Since about the 2003 timeframe, the principal policy concern of the United States in its relations with Iran has been the fear that Iran will develop the capability to develop, deploy, and use a nuclear weapon. In this episode of Horns, we listen to a discussion between Will Inboden, Executive Director of the Clements Center, and Michael Singh, Managing Director and Senior Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy and Interim Director of the Institute's Glaser Program on Great Power Competition in the Middle East. Inboden and Singh discuss the long history of U.S. nuclear negotiations and pressure on Iran. As well, Singh gives a background on why it is that this matters. What's so bad about a nuclear-armed Iran? What are the concerns the United States has? And what are the prospects both for the success of nuclear negotiations and the long-term stability of the Iranian regime? Let's listen in.
I'm Will Inboden, Executive Director of the Clements Center for National Security, so I'm represented by this banner. And because I'm so honored, I am also the faculty advisor for the Alexander Hamilton Society, so I'm also appropriately in front of this one. So dual hat here today. So a brief introduction on our speaker. Mike Singh is, I think it's safe to say, one of the country, or really world's leading experts on U.S. policy in the Middle East overall, and U.S.-Iran relations in particular. So it's a real honor to have him here. He did his undergraduate degree at Princeton, and then in another academic digression, did an MBA at Harvard Business School, which was a fascinating degree, but absolutely nothing to prepare him for further foreign policy work. But along the way, Mike was a Foreign Service officer with the State Department. He was posted at our embassy at the time in Tel Aviv before his move to Jerusalem. Then did a number of years in senior positions at what we call Main State, the State Department headquarters, including being one of the top aides to Colin Powell when he was Secretary of State, and then to Condi Rice when he was Secretary of State. And then a number of years on the National Security Council staff in the second term of the Bush administration as our top official handling Middle East policy. And then for a number of years since then, Mike has been one of the leaders, the managing director of the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, which is widely regarded as the most influential, important Middle East policy think tank in Washington, with a really tremendous array of experts there. And so Mike is running the show and herding the cats there, in addition to keeping up his own scholarship and policy engagement on U.S. Middle East policy. So he and I are going to have a conversation today focused primarily on Iran and U.S. Relations with Iran and some of the broader challenges there. But I'm sure it will meander into some other Middle Eastern topics as well. So we'll have our conversation, and we'll allow ample time afterwards for Q&A. All right, Mike, so let's start. Just give us an overview. What is the current state of play on U.S.-Iran relations? We're seeing some stuff in the news about these on-again, off-again nuclear negotiations, but a number of other concerns with Iran as well. So give us a snapshot of where things stand now, and then we'll kind of delve into how we got here and where we go from there.
Sure. Well, let me first say thanks for having me here. It's always a pleasure to come down to Austin and to UT. I have tremendous respect for both of these organizations represented on the banners. I'm a frequent speaker at AHS events, and if you ask me, the Clements Center is one of the best, I should say, public policy centers in the country. I think that I have enormous respect for Will, who I've known a long time, and for all the faculty and fellows at the Clements Center. So Iran, obviously this is a huge topic in our foreign policy, and a topic which gets a lot of attention because it's one of the few foreign policy topics that really resonates in a domestic way. And it has also been one which has been very controversial, as you guys will know, because for the last at least 5 or 6 years, this is an issue which has been a highly partisan issue in the United States. It wasn't always that way. For a long time, Iran sanctions, for example, in Congress were one of the few things you could get 100-0 vote on in the Senate. No longer. Now there's a deep split between Republicans and Democrats on Iran, and a lot of what's happening today is a consequence of our own divisions over this issue here. And so let me rewind a little bit, and I'm going to rewind before even this latest nuclear deal was negotiated. I'm going to rewind all the way to 2002, 2003, because that was when the Iranian nuclear program, more or less sort of as it stands today, it's much larger now, but the basic structure is the same, was revealed to the public. Now, the U.S. government had some concerns about Iran's nuclear program before that, but I would say it was a real turning point in American relations with Iran, where we went from having terrorism as our chief concern with respect to Iran to having nuclear weapons as our chief concern with respect to Iran. And it's not to say that we all of a sudden dropped everything else and focused on Iran. Obviously, 2002, 2003, there were other things going on in American foreign policy. I don't really remember them. But it wasn't our chief concern, not for several years after that. There were a number of agreements negotiated between the so-called E3, that's the UK, France, and Germany, and Iran. There was one in 2003, another in 2004, to limit Iran's nuclear program. In the judgment of the US and E3, Iran violated both of those deals, and that brought us to around 2005. And in 2005, Iran elected a hardline president, a guy named Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, who basically said, to heck with this nuclear limitation idea. He broke the seals that the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, had placed on Iran's nuclear equipment, and he started to expand Iran's nuclear program. And when I say he, of course, I'm glossing over the complexities of Iran's political system. It's not really the Iranian president that's in charge of the nuclear program. It's Iran's supreme leader, and there's other officials. But again, I'm going to gloss over that for now. Maybe we will
come back to that
later. That started basically a cycle of confrontation that we're in even now. Because Iran expanded its nuclear program, and the US and E3 had to decide how we in turn would respond. And we responded by creating something that we call the P5+1. And the P5+1, P5 means the permanent 5 members of the Security Council. That's the US, the UK, France, Russia, and China. I think that's 5, if I counted correctly. And the +1 is Germany, which doesn't have a permanent seat on the UN Security Council, but is a member of the E3, which have been negotiating with Iran. These countries came together and adopted what we call the dual track approach. The one track being diplomacy. Let's see if we can negotiate yet another deal with Iran limiting its nuclear program. The other track being pressure. And the pressure track had several different sort of sub-tracks, if you will. One was UN Security Council sanctions. We adopted numerous UN Security Council sanctions, mostly unanimous, imposing sanctions on Iran for its nuclear activities. But there was also pressure in the form of a program of ad hoc sanctions, which at the time were relatively new. And these were sanctions targeting Iran's financial sector, its banks, its hydrocarbon sector, which is really the sort of lifeline of its economy, and other key sectors of the Iranian economy, using the UN Security Council sanctions as a foundation, but basically gathering willing countries to sign up for even more powerful sanctions on top of those consensus UN sanctions, which themselves weren't very powerful. The other track was a military track. And this was the idea that even if Iran chose to defy the sanctions, to weather the economic pressure, that ultimately the US was willing to use military force to stop Iran's nuclear program if necessary as a last resort. So this was the dual track sort of policy for the United States. And that policy was created by President George W. Bush. It was basically continued by President Obama with some modifications. He favored more direct engagement with Iran. So he tried initially to reach out very directly to Iranian leadership. Initially didn't get very far with that, but essentially continued that dual track policy, which he inherited from his predecessor and enjoyed a lot of bipartisan support in Washington. The real change came around, I would say, 2011, 2012, when suddenly that outreach that President Obama had engaged in with the Iranians started to turn into something more serious. And you had essentially a back channel, a diplomatic back channel, developed between the United States and Iran. And really it was in that back channel that eventually the core of what would become the so-called JCPOA. That's the 2015 nuclear deal, and that stands for Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which is the sort of a typical meaningless Washington phrase, which tells you nothing about what it actually contains. Those back channel talks, bilateral talks, are really what produced the JCPOA. And the US then essentially brought that negotiation, brought that deal to its P5+1 partners, and they endorsed it. They endorsed it not just individually, but they endorsed it through a UN Security Council resolution. The difficulty, of course, for President Obama was that while the UN Security Council endorsed it, the US Congress did not. He brought it to the Security Council before he brought it to Congress. And when he brought it to Congress, which he was required to do by an act of Congress called INARA, and I won't bother with what that one stands for because I think I've forgotten. Somebody out in the audience probably knows. Congress essentially was allowed under that act to disapprove of a deal between the U.S. and Iran if they could muster a two-thirds supermajority to do so. Congress had its vote. More than half of Congress voted against the deal, but not two-thirds. And so the deal went through, the JCPOA. However, the controversy and debate in 2015, when this came forward, again, polarized opinion over this deal, both in Congress and to some extent in the country, although probably less so in the country than in Congress. And you had Republicans all against this deal, some Democrats, especially centrist Democrats, against the deal, and Democrats, other than those few centrists who voted against it, largely for the deal. And President Obama essentially claimed this as his major foreign policy achievement, his signature foreign policy achievement, really. That, in turn, led to, I would say, President Trump, when he was elected, having called this deal the worst deal of all time, so on and so forth. He held a rally in front of the White House to protest against the deal. It led him to withdraw from the deal once he became president. Not right away. This was sort of, a part of a bigger story with the Trump administration, where you had advisors around President Trump who basically tried to get him to be a little bit more cautious, not withdraw from the deal, but rather use the threat of withdrawal to improve the deal, essentially. He eventually dismissed that policy and chose to withdraw. And when he withdrew, and that was in May of 2018, the U.S. reimposed our sanctions on Iran. And so we ended up in this odd place where in the past we had been together with our allies, those P5+1 countries, the E3 countries, and really most of the world, in both our diplomacy and our pressure against Iran. When the U.S. withdrew, those tables were turned. And we and only a handful of other countries supported the policy that the Trump administration was embarking on. The rest of the world still supported the deal that was negotiated by President Obama, the JCPOA. And they wouldn't withdraw from it or sign up for pressure. And that set the table for where we are now. Because when President Biden was campaigning for office, this again was one of the few issues where he actually penned an op-ed himself, and I can't think of another issue in which he did this. Maybe he did something like that in China, I'm not sure. But he penned an op-ed himself. I think it was on time.com or something, which I always thought strange, because I guess New York Times rejected his op-ed or something.
No one reads Time.
Outlining what his policy would be. And he said he would go back into the JCPOA, which was something that I think was very popular amongst Democrats, especially those who were advocates of the deal and those who felt that President Trump's so-called maximum pressure policy was isolating the United States and not paying dividends for the United States. But that he would then also, after going back into the deal, try to negotiate a subsequent deal with Iran that was stronger than the original JCPOA. And that was interesting because it was an implicit acknowledgement that some of the critics' concerns about the JCPOA maybe were valid, that maybe the JCPOA, which was presented by the Obama administration in 2015 as essentially a great deal that didn't really require any subsequent deals to build upon it, that maybe that wasn't true, that maybe in fact there were some imperfections in this deal. Maybe the deal was flawed, especially as you started to look at longer time horizons. And that a subsequent deal was necessary to replace it. And what that meant was that, oddly, and implicitly still, because neither one I think would characterize it this way, you had, once again, a sort of bipartisan convergence over Iran policy. Because both President Trump and President Biden essentially said, we need a new deal with Iran, we need a stronger deal. And we're going to use our leverage, whatever that may be, economic leverage, military leverage, and so forth, to try to get that. Obviously, they differ tremendously in the details, but the basic idea was not so different from one administration to the next. When the Biden administration came in, though, I think it found that not only had U.S. policy changed, but the Iranian perspective had changed as well. And I think that they anticipated that first step, going back into the JCPOA, that would be the easy part. Because Iran, while it had egregiously violated the JCPOA, since the Trump administration's withdrawal. It waited about a year, and then it started taking nuclear steps to expand its nuclear program well beyond the limits and constraints stipulated in the JCPOA, to the point where it was becoming actually quite alarming from a non-proliferation standpoint, where Iran had gotten to with its nuclear program. Even though Iran had done those things, it hadn't formally withdrawn from the JCPOA. And so I think the consensus opinion amongst analysts was, oh, well, they're leaving themselves a pathway to go back into the deal if the U.S. makes that offer. But the Biden administration came and made that offer, said we'll go back to the JCPOA, we'll relieve sanctions as stipulated by the JCPOA, and as long as you do the same. And Iran said, no thanks, essentially. Iran said no thanks for lots of different reasons, which we can speculate on, but we can't say for sure because Iranians don't tend to explain these things in speeches. They don't issue a national security strategy. We can only guess, really based on speeches, documents, negotiating positions, and so forth, by inference, what their stance is. And I would attribute it to a couple of things. Number one, it does seem as though Iran felt that the economic relief it obtained under the JCPOA was not as significant as it had hoped for. And there are a couple of reasons for that. Number one, a lot of U.S. sanctions remained in place, and that in itself was probably a deterrent to some economic actors from doing business in Iran. But I think actually much more powerfully, there were other deterrents, other obstacles to doing business in Iran that led a lot of major economic actors in places like Europe and Asia quite wary. And that was Iran's continuing support for terrorism, its continuing sort of objectionable policies in Iraq, Syria, and elsewhere, and maybe even most powerfully, simply the sort of economic conditions in Iran itself. Iran isn't an easy place to do business, even absent sanctions, because of its non-compliance with various money laundering and other financial regulations, which are common around the world. So Iran didn't obtain the sanctions relief it was hoping for, and I think it had unrealistic hopes. It also saw how easy it was for the U.S. to withdraw and reimpose sanctions, which I think was actually a surprise to most of the world. I think most of the world felt that it would be tough for the U.S. to do that unilaterally without, again, sort of UN Security Council blessing to do it. Obviously, that didn't prove to be the case. The Trump administration quite powerfully reimposed sanctions on Iran. And so the Iranians were looking for some kind of guarantee that the U.S. wouldn't or couldn't do this again. And these are really still the issues which they're negotiating over in Vienna. So now I'll actually fast forward to where we are now. We're now trying to negotiate in Vienna indirectly because the Iranian side won't meet with the United States. So we're negotiating through the Europeans, through the Russians and Chinese, negotiating that mutual re-entry into the JCPOA. And the issues on the table are essentially threefold. They're more than three, but there's three key ones. Number one is Iran rolling back its nuclear activity. So the U.S. expectation, as far as I know, is that Iran would roll its nuclear activities back to where they should be if Iran were complying with the JCPOA. I'm not going to get into the technical details of that. We can delve into it, but it does start to get technical very quickly. So I'll avoid that for now. It's not clear to me whether Iran is willing to do this. I think from Iran's point of view, they'd like to keep some of the advances that they were able to make in the last couple of years. And in any case, some of them represent advances in knowledge, which there really is no way to roll those things back. You can take away physical hardware, but you can't take away the knowledge that they've obtained in the meantime. The second big issue on the table is sanctions. As I mentioned, Iran wants the U.S. to relieve not just the sanctions stipulated in the JCPOA, but also additional sanctions beyond that. Both sanctions which were imposed by the Trump administration that sort of replicate the effect of sanctions under the JCPOA, as well as additional sanctions which actually have nothing to do with Iran's nuclear program. For example, the designation of Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps as a terrorist organization. And then the third issue is this issue of guarantees. And it's perhaps the sort of hardest issue of all, because Iran, again, wants a guarantee that no future American president will again withdraw from the deal. In our political system, really, you can't offer those kinds of guarantees. Even if the Iran nuclear deal were a treaty, which it isn't, a treaty requires the advice and consent of the Senate, which means a 2/3 vote in the Senate. Even if you were able to get that, the U.S. could still, under executive authority, likely withdraw from a treaty, as we have done in the past. So the Trump administration, for example, withdrew from the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, the so-called INF Treaty. It did so by executive action. And that's possible for most treaties.
Bush withdrew from the ABM treaty similarly to, yeah.
Right. So there really is no guarantee that President Biden could provide that would be ironclad, even if he wanted to. And it's not clear to me whether he wants to or not. So that's the third big issue on the table. The backdrop of all of this, of course, is Iran's expanding nuclear program. And Iran's program has expanded to the point where the U.S. Secretary of State has said, look, we only have a few more weeks before we get to a point where it's no longer in the U.S. interest to go back into this deal. Now, critics would say it isn't in the U.S. interest anyway to go back into the deal, but even the Biden administration, which has strongly advocated the deal, has said in a few weeks it won't be worth going back in because Iran's nuclear advances will have gotten so significant that the deal will no longer serve American interests, and it'll be too difficult to roll back Iran's nuclear advances. So we're really at the moment of truth, and the question for the United States then will become, what's Plan B? And that, I think, is a very tough question for the U.S. because we don't want to see Iran's nuclear program continue to expand. We would prefer not to get into another war in the Middle East. But absent a deal, there aren't great options available to the Biden administration, at least not easy options. And that's a situation they could face very soon. Maybe I'll stop there.
No, a lot to chew on there, and that's actually a nice tee up. Let me almost step back for a little bit and ask a couple of the more foundational questions, which are the backdrop to why we're in this current complicated impasse over the JCPOA negotiations, and these are mirror images of each other. First, what does Iran want? And by this, what does the supreme leadership, the senior levels of the Iranian government, Ayatollah Khamenei, President Raisi, what do they want in terms of a nuclear weapon, or do they actually want a nuclear weapon, or rather just a nuclear capability? And why? Like, what would they actually want to do with it? And then the mirror image of that, why should the U.S. not want them to have that, and why should Israel not want them to have it? Because the U.S. and Israel clearly don't want them to have it. So what are the core issues at stake here? What do they want, and why do we not want them to have it?
Sure, and look, I would say that there is no country in the region that wants Iran to have a nuclear weapon, whether they have very poor relations with Iran or even the ones that have better relations with Iran, because nuclear proliferation is rarely good, seen as good by anyone. Look, the Iranian regime is undoubtedly focused on regime survival as its number one goal, and that has both foreign policy and domestic policy aspects. That doesn't really necessarily tell us much, though, because that's a very basic kind of goal. What's important to know, I think, about Iran is that the current regime has pursued a national security strategy, which is one that we would call unusual, not what we would think of as a sort of traditional national security policy. This is not a country that forms alliances with neighbors. It's not a country that really engages in traditional forms of diplomacy for the most part. It's really not a country, quite concerningly for the United States, which is respectful of the sovereignty of neighbors to a degree quite beyond other countries in the region. What we see the regime pursuing is a strategy which aims to do a couple of things. Number one, and most importantly, keep potential foes occupied elsewhere, right? So if you look at the kind of Middle East around Iran, Iran's got lots of adversaries around it. Saudi Arabia, for example, Israel used to have Iraq as an adversary. And in each case, we have seen Iran cultivate proxies in third countries, which can threaten the security of those adversaries of Iran. So in Lebanon, for example, you have a group called Hezbollah. Hezbollah is a Lebanese group. It was created by Iran, by Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps. And it's understood that should Israel decide to go to war with Iran, Hezbollah would attack Israel, which serves obviously as a deterrent for Israel from attacking Iran. And also, Hezbollah has tended to attack Israel, even if Israel's not attacking Iran. And that is a way of sort of keeping Israel preoccupied with its northern border as opposed to focusing on, say, Iran or other concerns. In Yemen, Iran has cultivated a group called the Houthis, not so much as a proxy, not in the sense that Hezbollah in Lebanon is a proxy, but as a sort of partner of sorts. A partner which is highly dependent now on Iran, especially for its military armaments. And ensuring that the Houthis have advanced weaponry, have sufficient arms, is a way of ensuring they can continue to wage war against Saudi Arabia the United Arab Emirates, and so forth, both of which are regional adversaries of Iran. The Iranians do other things as well. They have engaged in support for terrorism around the world. They engage in irregular naval warfare in the Gulf. You have irregular Iranian naval units which attack oil tankers, which have attacked naval vessels, and so on and so forth. And so it's essentially a strategy of projecting asymmetric power and going around governments for the most part, as opposed to dealing with governments. So they're looking for fifth columns, as it were, in the countries around the region. And you might ask, why do they do this? And it's in large part, I would say, something that flows from the nature of the regime itself. So when this regime came into power in 1979, it came into power via revolution against the monarchist forces. And so, as a result, the revolutionary regime viewed the Army, Navy, Air Force of Iran with great suspicion because these were monarchist institutions, essentially. So, in parallel to each one of those institutions, the regime created a revolutionary institution. You have the Revolutionary Guard Corps. The Revolutionary Guard Corps has an Air Force, it has a Navy, and so forth. And those revolutionary institutions, and this is paralleled on the civilian side of things as well, in that Iran has, say, a president as well as a supreme leader. It has a parliament as well as a assembly of experts, and so on and so forth. Those institutions, the revolutionary institutions, grew more powerful. The traditional institutions, Army, Navy, Air Force, grew less powerful. And so you had a different set of institutions with a very different way of operating that essentially came to dominate the national security sphere in Iran. Needless to say, this national security strategy is one that is sort of seen as totally unacceptable by all the other countries around Iran, and really by the United States and others. So when you hear American politicians say things like Iran should behave like a normal country, oftentimes this is the sort of thing they're talking about. It's the idea of Iran, say, going into a place like Iraq, going around the government to create its own militias, which it pays to create problems inside Iraq, for example. That's something which is deemed outside the bounds of acceptable behavior by states. How does a nuclear weapon fit into all of this? Given that Iran really has no allies in the region, it's got a lot of adversaries, you can understand maybe why Iran would want a nuclear weapon. It worries a lot about those adversaries and what they might do, and so there's a defensive purpose, for sure, with a nuclear weapon. But what we have seen in the past is that countries with nuclear weapons, while they don't use the nuclear weapons themselves for offense, that is a worry that we would have with Iran, that it would actually use nuclear weapons, but I wouldn't say it's the chief worry, because obviously using nuclear weapons would probably come at an enormous cost for Iran, and as it would for any other country. It's that having those nuclear weapons and the deterrent they would provide would actually embolden Iran to pursue that strategy I was just describing, that sort of strategy of projecting asymmetric power with even greater impunity, because it wouldn't worry so much that it would cross a line that would cause Israel to attack or the United States to attack, and so forth. There's also a worry that if Iran were to develop nuclear weapons, other countries in the region would follow. You might have nuclear weapons, and I won't, you can imagine for yourself, you might have a sort of a wave of proliferation in the region, which has typically been the way that nuclear proliferation has occurred. It doesn't happen just once and then stop. It happens once, and then countries which feel threatened by that then tend to want to develop their own. And because the Middle East is not an area where we would assume that countries would feel as though they had strategic depth, secure second strike capability, all these things we talk about in terms of nuclear policy, you would worry about countries adopting a sort of first use policy, having a sort of hair trigger approach to nuclear weapons, and that creating more risk of instability and of war in the region. So, needless to say, we have lots of reasons why we don't want to see Iran develop nuclear weapons. We don't want to see other countries in the region develop nuclear weapons either, and we worry that that would be triggered by Iran.
Yeah. Well, let's follow up on one that you had mentioned earlier, which, of course, is Israel's concerns and Iran's threat to Israel. And, of course, Israel is, the United States' most important partner in the region, long-time friend. But it's clear that over the last, decade or so in particular, with some of these negotiations, that Israel has, sometimes, felt some tension or distance between where the U.S. has been on this, and seems more so now. So how much are the U.S. and Israel aligned on the current negotiations? First part of the question. Second part of the question, if Israel decides that Iran is either too close to the threshold of a nuclear weapon, or that whatever emerging agreement will concede too much to Iran, how likely is it you think that Israel might take unilateral military action, and what that might mean for U.S.-Israel relations?
So the Israelis have felt particularly threatened by Iran for a couple of reasons. Number one, because Iran issues specific threats against Israel. They do these missile launches, and oftentimes the Iranians will write in Hebrew on the side of the missiles that, hey, Israel, this is for you. And the Iranian politicians will threaten to destroy Israel. One of Iran's past presidents, who's since passed away, famously called Israel a one-bomb country. In other words, could be eliminated with one nuclear weapon. So those types of threats make Israel feel insecure, but also Israel battles on a daily basis with Iranian military units and proxies in Syria, in Lebanon, and so forth. And so Israel feels threatened, I would say, in a more direct way than other countries in the region do. Israel also has more capability generally to do something about it than other countries in the region do. And that has put Israel really at the kind of center of U.S. discussions in the region over the Iran issue. Also, obviously, Israel is a country whose attitudes and policies enormously influence opinion in the United States, which also creates a real impetus for any administration to make sure they're aligned to some extent with Israel. We saw during the negotiation of the JCPOA that the U.S. and Israel weren't aligned. I would say probably the U.S. and most regional partners weren't aligned, and that really imposed significant costs, I would say, on for U.S. strategy. That was probably one of the reasons why President Obama had a very difficult time getting domestic support for his policy, because Prime Minister Netanyahu, the Israeli Prime Minister at the time, came to Congress and gave a speech directly opposing the nuclear deal. At the time, I think that the Israelis felt the nuclear deal was flawed, and they worried that ultimately the nuclear deal would not stop Iran from getting nuclear weapons, but might actually, over time, create a pathway for them to develop nuclear weapons. They also worried about the relief of sanctions on Iran. You fast forward to today, and I would say it's less clear where the Israeli government is today on the question of Iran and the negotiations, but I think their worries are still the same. I think a lot of countries in the region look at Iran, they see how far it's gotten towards a nuclear weapons capability, and they worry that Iran is already a sort of de facto threshold nuclear state, for whatever that may mean. And they also worry that the relief of sanctions on Iran will cause lots of additional revenues to flow into the Iranian regime's coffers, and that will increase Iran's other troublesome activities in the region, its funding for Hezbollah and proxies and so forth. It seems to me that, for the most part, the Israelis today are more focused on that second part. If you listen to what Israeli officials say, they worry more about a deal relieving the financial pressure on Iran than they do anything else. And so my guess is that the Israelis' chief concern right now is that the United States will make a deal which has, from the Israeli point of view, insufficient non-proliferation benefit, but more importantly gives them a lot of sanctions relief in ways that causes problems sort of with respect to Iran's other policies. But what you don't see today is you don't see that very public falling out between the U.S. and Israel. And I think that's sort of because both sides sort of look back at 2015, 2016 as something not to be repeated. I think they both see the value in ensuring that they keep their disagreements more private, that they remain more publicly aligned for fear that the kind of public disagreement falling out actually benefits our mutual adversaries. And you've seen, to their credit, the Biden administration also trying, I think, harder than the Obama administration did to consult with regional partners. And obviously the context today is quite different, and we can get more into that, but I think that they also, again, are determined not to repeat that mistake. It doesn't mean the end result will be any more pleasing to those regional partners, but at least you see the consultations going on.
Yeah. All right. Two more questions from me, and then we will turn it over to the audience. The audience, be thinking of your questions as well. First one is, this is stepping back a little bit from the nuclear file, which is rightly our main focus here today, but this getting to the Iranian regime's legitimacy and stability, and particularly what the Iranian people think. And of course, the 2009 Green Movement protests were a real wake-up call for a lot of the rest of the world, realizing, wow, some of the Iranian people don't like being oppressed and tormented and brutalized by their own government, let alone the economic privation, so on and so forth. And since then, there have been different flare-ups of demonstration protests. But what is your sense for where most of the Iranian people think about their government, and then in turn, how secure is that government's hold on power?
Well, obviously, these are tough questions to answer. I mean,
but that's why we've got you here. Okay.
One of the toughest questions to answer in foreign policy is, how stable is this or that country? Yeah. When is it going to tip over into chaos? We've never been good at predicting it. I think what you can say is, looking at Iran in now the sort of essentially 40 plus years of the Islamic Republic, that especially in the last couple of decades, we have seen pretty continuous protests. Those protests haven't abated despite the significant violence the regime has been willing to use in response to them. You haven't seen something akin to the sort of 2009 protests, that was the so-called Green Movement, since 2009. Obviously, there was a very harsh crackdown on those protests, but you have seen continued protests. And you have seen other signs of low legitimacy. So if you look at, for example, the last elections in Iran, there was a very low turnout for those elections, which suggests a certain disillusionment on the part of the population. I think you can also see signs in how the regime itself is trying to respond to that low legitimacy. As I said, regime survival, I think, is the number one aim of the regime. That should come as a surprise, and that's true in many other places as well. But I think you have seen, again, an implicit difference of view among factions within the regime as to how best to ensure the survival of the regime. Because you have this clear disconnect between Iran's youthful population and the regime itself. The sort of the spirit or the kind of concerns which motivated protesters and revolutionaries in 1979 are not the concerns of Iranian young people today. And so you've had one faction, I would say, in the regime which has taken the view that in order to survive, the regime needs to adapt. It needs to liberalize economically, to some extent socially, in order to avoid liberalization or discontinuity politically, right? In order to avoid being overthrown politically. And that's not so dissimilar from, say, what we saw in China over the last few decades of the 20th century. But then you have a more, I would say, hardline faction, which thinks that the answer is not to adapt, and it thinks, in fact, that kind of liberalization will be what spells the downfall of the regime, and that what the regime needs to do in order to survive is to kind of reinstill that spirit of ~79 in Iran's population by going back to the sort of original tenets of the revolution, sort of an economic autarky, for example, anti-Americanism, refusal to deal with the West. And that faction is really the faction which is in power today. And you see them trying to implement these things. And because Iran's economy has grown over the past year, its oil exports have grown over the past year, they probably feel some vindication. I'm not sure those things have actually anything to do with their political ideology, but I'm sure they're riding high at the moment. And at what point all of this breaks, at what point the regime can no longer manage this, we don't know. I mean, that's a question we ask ourselves about every autocratic regime, which has low legitimacy. And we can debate the sort of answer till the cows come home, and we'll never really reach a satisfying conclusion. I think what we try to do in the U.S. government is we try to support those who want democracy, who want greater freedoms, and so forth. And we try to do it in as smart a way as we can. Usually that means trying to ensure that those people have the tools, have greater space to do what it is they want to do, rather than trying to put ourselves out front in advocating for some kind of change in Iran. But obviously that's one of the hardest things you can do in policy. And so far today, as I said, the regime is 42 years in. And probably in 1979, not everyone thought they would get this far, unfortunately.
Yeah. So, all right. Final question from me before we'll turn it over to the audience, and I'll preface it with this: is you've given us some very insightful analysis here over the last 30, 40 minutes, and the state of play of the negotiations, different factions within Iran, so on and so forth. I want to push you a little bit for your prescription, if you will, and it's a two-part question. First, if you were advising President Biden, or if you were president yourself, a decision maker, do you think at this stage, with everything that's gone before, there still is some sort of deal to be had that would be reasonably viable to, prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon? And if so, what would the terms of that deal be? Second, if that deal fails or the negotiations fail, and it's clear that Iran is either a turnkey away from having a nuclear weapon or actually does a test, would you support the U.S. participating in any sort of military action, maybe along with Israel?
So I guess what I would say is I think it's worth pursuing a deal. I'm personally skeptical that ultimately we can reach one that will be satisfactory. If ultimately, I think there are a lot of reasons to pursue diplomacy. One, because you actually hope to reach a deal. Number two, though, I think it's actually important for managing your coalition, keeping your coalition together, that you be seen to be seriously interested in diplomacy. And so I think it is worth doing. I think, though, that when we pursue diplomacy in the United States, we often treat diplomacy as an alternative to other things, to pressure, to military deterrence, and so forth. And I think that's wrong. I think you have to pursue those things in parallel, because ultimately a negotiation is an equation. It's a comparison. You want the regime to compare the deal that's on the table with whatever their best alternative is. And so what pressure does, hopefully, is it worsens the regime's, the other parties' assessment of their best alternative to the deal that's on offer. That, I think, is something that we haven't done enough of. So I think, and in fact, as I mentioned, you've heard the Biden administration talk about switching over, as it were, ending the negotiations in a few weeks and kind of switching over to pressure. I actually think that kind of idea of a sequential approach is wrong. I think you need to pursue pressure and diplomacy in parallel if you're going to succeed. Now, it's possible that won't work. And if it doesn't work, what you would hope is that we could somehow contain and deter Iran, that we could deal with the nuclear threat if we can't get a deal, not by having to actually go in with a military strike, but by somehow being able to use that pressure, use the threat of military force to deter them from moving forward. But if that doesn't work, and if we believe that they're sort of making that sort of sprint to a nuclear weapon, then absolutely we should be willing to use military force to stop that. Now, what that looks like, I can't sit here and tell you, but it is something that is one of the key interests when it comes to the national security of the United States, is ensuring that states like Iran, North Korea, and so forth don't have nuclear weapons. North Korea does have nuclear weapons now, and you see them developing ballistic missiles which can reach the United States. We wouldn't want to see that repeated with Iran. That doesn't necessarily mean, I hope, repeating what we did in 2003 vis-a-vis Iraq. Hopefully it's something much more limited than that. And you start to get into speculation about the future, which really is something that might be a futile exercise. But I think we absolutely need to have that willingness. But more importantly, we need to ensure that Iran understands that we have that willingness, so hopefully we can deter them with the threat rather than actually having to exercise that option.
So, that was it. To interject my own views a little bit here, was a concern I always had with the initial phases of the Obama administration's negotiations, where they so clearly took military force off the table, made clear we never want to do this. And even if you don't want to do it, you don't tell the Iranians that, right? Because you want them to at least worry that might be a possibility. And then second, made clear about being so desperate for a deal that conceded even a lot of the sanctions leverage as well. And so sometimes the best way to avoid having to use force is to be willing to threaten it or some tougher measures. So.
I think with many of these types of problems, you have to be willing to tread a middle path, right? It's important that even when you're dealing with adversaries, they believe that there is a deal to be had, right? That you're open to negotiation and diplomacy, that door isn't closed. But they also need to believe that you're prepared to accept the cost of their alternatives if that diplomacy fails. I think that shutting down either path is a mistake. And that applies both to this context as well as other contexts.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma, and please don't forget to visit our website at tnsr.org.